So in this video, we're going to be going over is Esperanto a real language? Now, before we go into the specifics of whether or not Esperanto is a real language, I think it would be useful if we first define what exactly makes up what someone would call a quote unquote real language. Now, the list that I have here isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but this should cover anywhere from like 90 to 95% of what someone would generally consider a quote unquote real language. Now, first of all, every language has to have like some kind of structure, and that structure is going to be made up of sounds, signs, and or written symbols. Now, with signs, like obviously not every language is written. Like for example, you have like American Sign Language, for instance, and a few other countries have their own sign language. So as long as you can do something that can somehow has some sort of meaning tied to it, which we'll talk about meaning later, but there should be some sort of system to the language that makes it unrecognizable from any other language. Another thing about language that you might not really think about is the fact that all languages are tied in some way to culture. Just to give you an example, like when you think about the language French, the French culture is closely intertwined with it. Or when you think about like English, like especially American English, you think about American English, you have our American culture. And then there's the language like Spanish, for instance, where we'll talk about like Mexican Spanish or Spain Spanish. There's a close tie between the language that is spoken as well as the culture that is associated with that language. So while language isn't in itself like culture, it's definitely closely intertwined and is what is used to help transmit that culture from one generation to the next. Another thing about language is that languages tend to be very dynamic, and they're dynamic in the sense that languages change and evolve. So to give you an example of like languages changing and evolving, like let's take English for example. Now, if you were to go and to look at like let's say like Shakespeare's work, like from back in the day, you see like while they do speak English like in Shakespeare, the English that is spoken back then is very different from the English that is spoken now, and the English that is spoken right now is going to be probably much different than the English that's spoken, say, like, a few hundred years in the future when there's like new technologies, new concepts, all sorts of like unimaginable changes that can happen. So, languages do tend to change over time, like depending on the context, depending on like what's happening around, like in the world and stuff. So, they don't stay static. Another thing is variation. So this is kind of similar to the whole dynamic thing, but basically a language should allow you to say something in more than one way. So I could say that I'm a human, but I can also say like I'm a person. Like they're both kind of like the same thing, but also kind of a little bit different too at the same time. But they're both more or less expressing the same idea. And last but not least, all languages are meaningful in the sense that all symbols slash signals in the language are meaningful. So this is kind of implied already to like all the other previous things that we talk about, but I think it is important to like highlight this separately. Like that's kind of like the whole reason why language came up in the first place is by being able to create like meaningful sounds or gestures that could be transmitted from one person to the next. So now that we have a basic idea of like what are the characteristics of a real language, let's go through Esperanto and see if Esperanto can check all of these boxes. So first off, let's talk about the structure of Esperanto. So the structure of Esperanto is that it's made up of 28 letters, and is based on the Latin alphabet. It also has some six diacritical letters, which you can see here. So we have the C, the G, the H, the J, the S, as well as U, and all of them have like a little hat like on top of them. And something interesting to note is that Esperanto has 23 consonants as well as five vowels, and it doesn't happen to use the letters Q, W, X, or Y. So that's something a little interesting to note. Another thing about Esperanto, like in terms of its structure, is that every part of speech has a characteristic ending. So to give you an example of that, in Esperanto, all nouns end in the letter O. So nouns is just a person, a place, or a thing. You see that there's basically like no exception to that. All adjectives end in the letter A. All adverbs end in the letter E. And so on and so forth. So there's definitely a structure there when it comes to Esperanto. Another thing too, when it comes to pronouncing words in Esperanto, it's important to note that the accent on every word is on the second to last syllable. So if you want to know like how many syllables are in a word in Esperanto, all you have to do is count the vowels. So depending on the number of vowels that word has will determine the number of syllables. So if it has one vowel, it has one syllable. If it has two vowels, it has two syllables, and so on and so forth. So the way that you pronounce any word in Esperanto is that you always put the stress on the second to last syllable. Now, if you have a word that has just like a one vowel in it, so just one syllable, then it would just you would just pronounce that particular vowel. But when words that have more than one vowel, of course, then it would just be the second to last. And last but not least, and this is probably one of the most important things in regards to the structure of Esperanto, is that there are 16 fundamental rules. So when Dr. Zamenhof, the creator of Esperanto, when he went and published what's called the La Anua Libro, which is the first book of Esperanto, in that book, he outlined some of the 16 fundamental rules of Esperanto. Now, even though there are these 16 rules, and you could definitely build on top of these rules, it's important to note that you're not limited. These rules don't really like limit you, so to speak. They just help to form like a stable foundation on which other things can be built upon. So, something you'll learn too, like if you do decide to learn Esperanto, while it is true that there are these 60 fundamental rules, there are a bunch of like smaller rules, so to speak, as far as how to go about speak of Esperanto, like in your day-to-day life. But everything ultimately comes down to these 16 fundamental rules. I've talked about on my blog, and you can find these 16 fundamental rules online. But yeah, these 16 fundamental rules are really important to understanding like on what Esperanto is all about and how it functions. So moving on, let's talk about the culture of Esperanto. So one thing that's commonly associated with like a culture is like the books or the literature of that language and or culture. And it's very interesting to note that Esperanto has over 25,000 books. And just to give you a point of comparison, like the entire literature of Iceland, and Iceland first arose like somewhere like within the 900s, has less than 50,000 books. So I can tell you that Esperanto has only been around for like a little bit over 100 years, and the fact that it has almost like half the number of books that Iceland, which has been around for way longer than Esperanto, is pretty considerable. Another thing that's pretty interesting about Esperanto's culture is it has something that's called a gufuyo. So a gufuyo is basically when a bunch of Esperantists they get together, to create a little like makeshift cafe. This can be done inside somebody's house or in a rented space, and they go and they use either real money or like Esperanto coins or like or vouchers or something like that to pay for the food and drinks. And something that's pretty common when it comes to these things is that like oftentimes like people do like poetry readings, there'll be some live music, there'll be like literature readings, like things like that. These are some of like the usual activities that you'll see at these gafuyos. The reason why these gafuyos like kind of came into existence is it was kind of done as a way to contrast against the usual custom of like partying at a bar after like a convention. Something to note about Esperanto is that they have like these annual conventions where Esperantos from like all over just kind of come together. They talk, they hang out with one another. So something they'll do like after like they they go to the convention and do the meetings and stuff is that they'll go to a bar. So the Kafuyo came up like just as somewhat to contrast against that, just something different to do that's more like that more embodies like the Esperanto culture. Last but not least, they have something that's known as a Passporto Servo. So this is basically a free service where Esperantists, it's a website that you can actually go on. It originally started off as a book, but now it's a website where you can go on this website and you can find people that are Esperantists from all over the world that are willing to offer free lodging to other Esperantists. Now, as far as like how that works and like the different like rules and stuff, that's going to be different depending on the person that's offered the lodging. But if you're someone that speaks Esperanto at a sufficiently high level, you can go and you can take advantage of the service. So let's say if there's some place you want to go, like in Europe, and it happens to be somebody that's an Esperantist that's offering free lodging, you can go and you can stay with that person for free for however long that you're able to negotiate with that person, and at the same time be able to connect with like another Esperanto speaker. So this is something that's a really cool service, and this is something I personally haven't taken advantage of yet, but this is something I definitely want to do like at some point in the future. So this is just a few examples of the type of culture that Esperanto has, but there's definitely like a lot more stuff that could be said. So moving on, let's talk about how Esperanto has evolved over the years. So when Esperanto first came out, it originally just had about 900 words, but after that 900 words, it actually grew like relatively quickly. Another thing to note too is that Esperanto does have a lot of like words that you would consider modern, like internet, Google, YouTube, and so on. So Esperanto does a pretty good job at keeping up with the times. While it may not have like a particular word for like every technical thing that exists in the world, like that probably doesn't exist in any language really, but English is just so widespread. So there are just so many words in English, but it manages to hold its own as far as just staying modern and staying up to date, with like the language that's used these days. Another thing that's interesting too about Esperanto, so I told you that Esperanto has 28 letters in total. So one of the letters is an H. So the way that the H, like with the little hat on top of it, it's pronounced like kind of like in the back of the throat. So it's kind of like a ho, so to speak. You know what I mean? And another thing, and something that's interesting is that this letter is pretty rarely used in Esperanto. Like this is an official letter, and you'll see it more so like within like old like Esperanto works and books and articles and stuff. But these days, you don't really see it that much, and I think that does represent a pretty interesting development. A lot of time, like words that did have the letter H, like it will be replaced like with the letter K or another appropriate letter. But it's pretty interesting to note that how even though this is a legitimate letter and it can be used, Esperanto speakers, generally speaking, have just kind of like moved away from this sound. So who knows? Maybe like within like another 30, 40, 50 years or however, like it may just disappear entirely. But, you will see it like here and there and you will see it with like certain words and stuff. But it is pretty interesting to know how, like it just kind of almost lost like an entire sound. Another thing too to note about the evolution of Esperanto is that many words have fallen in and out of use as well as changed meanings. So I have an example of here, which is respondi slash responsi. So the word right here, respondi, this basically means responding to someone that like asks you a question or just kind of like interacting with someone back and forth. Whereas responsi is basically to be like responsible for something. So one thing that's interesting is that the archaic meaning of respondi is responsi, which is to be responsible for something. But now that meaning has kind of fallen out of use. So now when you hear people use the word respondi, they mean it more so as just like responding to like a question, whereas responsi is more so the being responsible for something. So, that is something interesting to note. That's just one example, but, there's definitely plenty more. And this just kind of highlights just how, the language of Esperanto, it's not some static thing, but it's constantly has been changing and evolving over the years. So moving on, let's talk about the flexibility of Esperanto. One thing that's really cool about as far as the flexibility of Esperanto is that the word order is pretty flexible. So I have an example sentence up here, which is "mi havas monon kai monon mi havas." So both of these are basically saying the same thing, which is "I have money." But in the first sentence, I'm highlighting more so myself, which is "I that have money," and in the second sentence, I'm highlighting the thing that I have, which is money I have. But both of them mean the same thing, but there's slightly different emphasis. So that's just one. That's just a very simple example. But the fact that Esperanto has this flexible word order allows you to have a certain level of precision with your language that you can't really emulate with like a lot of other languages, especially English per se. Like English is very much so, excuse me, dependent on like the word order, and you can't really go and like switch like words around like all willy nilly like you can with Esperanto. Another thing too, which really speaks to the flexibility of Esperanto, is that it has a whole entire system of prefixes and suffixes, which allows you to express ideas in a very nuanced way. So like there's a bunch of different affixes. Like there's one affix that's called mal, and mal basically means like opposite. So if you put on mal with like the word bona, like malbona, that's basically the opposite of good, which is means bad. So that's just one example. And also it has like a range of idiomatic expressions and proverbs. So the first example I have here, I says me fife is pre. It literally translates to I whistle about, but really what you're saying is I don't care about. So you could put after pre, you could put like whatever. So you just say like I fife is pre, musical, since it's like I don't care about music. Another thing too, which is a very particular Esperanto word that is very difficult to translate into another language, is a word that's known as crocodili. So basically, what the word crocodili means is when you go and you speak Esperanto at a time. Well, excuse me. Crocodili means when you go and you speak a language when it will be more appropriate to speak Esperanto. So excuse me, just to give an example of that, like there are a bunch of different like chat groups in Esperanto. So the whole idea behind them, of course, is that you're supposed to be speaking Esperanto or writing Esperanto within the chat room. So if you were to go into like one of these chat rooms and to speak like your native language, say like it's English or French or whatever, you would be you'll be what's called crocodilian. Like I don't know why crocodili, because crocodili actually refers to like the animal crocodile, but as more like the slang meaning is used more as so like speaking like a language when it would be more appropriate to speak Esperanto. And you see like it's very hard to communicate like that idea of English, but in Esperanto, it's basically just on one word. So yeah, so like when you're in a situation where it will be more appropriate to speak Esperanto, you definitely don't want to be caught like on crocodilian, so to speak. And last but not least, they have this word called kabei. Now, this is a very interesting word. Actually, this word comes from like a guy whose name was Kabei. He was among like the first people that began speaking Esperanto. And one thing that was really unique about this guy is that he was very like a very prolific author. You know, he did like translations and stuff. Like he was a very like active member of the community. And then all of a sudden, he just went and he just completely like abandoned the movement just like out of the blue, like no explanation or anything like that. So that's how the word Quebec came to existence. So basically, like I don't know, some people kind of debate a little bit as far as like what the meaning Quebec means, but essentially to Quebec is when you're like really active within the Esperanto movement. You know, like you go to events, you know, you write stuff, you know, maybe like to make videos, you know, books or whatever. Like you know, you're an active member of the community, and then all of a sudden you just completely like abandon. You just like you leave Esperanto, you stop speaking the language, you don't talk about it anymore. That would be considered like kabeing, you know what I mean? So unfortunately, that you know that does happen. You know, some people just you know they get really into it, then they get out of it, you know. But you know that's life. So moving on, now let's talk about the semantics of Esperanto. So I think I've already kind of talked about it a little bit, you know, just with all the other stuff I said previously, but I wanted to give this like its own special section. So one thing that's really cool regarding like on the semantics of Esperanto is that Esperanto words can be broken down into individual elements. So I have an example up here called malbonulo. So like let's say if you never seen this word before, if you understand what each part means, you would be able to like infer the meaning of this word. So mal means opposite. Bone means good, and ulo is used for like a person. So when you have mal bon, that means bad, and ulo means person. Mal bonulo means bad person. So if you never seen this word before, but if you could just break it down like that, you'll be able to figure out what this word means. So another thing too, in regards to like the semantics of Esperanto, like when Esperanto was first coming about, like it went and it sources vocabulary from other languages, and I don't think anybody's going to argue that other languages have like meaning like baked within them. So just to give you some numbers here, about 75% of Esperanto's vocabulary comes from like the Romance languages. So we're talking like French, you know, Spanish, Italian, etc. Another 20% comes from like Germanic languages, like German, like English, and the rest of it comes from mainly like Slavic languages as well as Greek languages. So of course, these languages already have their own semantic meaning baked within it. So when Esperanto was first getting started, this is where it like kind of sourced its vocabulary. Another thing too, as far as the semantics of Esperanto, is that its grammar and vocabulary was designed to be very regular and consistent. So this makes it pretty easy when it comes to like just kind of breaking down like what a sentence means in Esperanto, or what a word means in Esperanto. Is that everything has really just been streamlined, and part of it comes from the fact of the 16 rules of Esperanto, which breaks everything down and gives you like sort of foundation, understand what Esperanto is about. But you know you can, even if you never come across like a sentence or a word before, like if you're able to break it down, like, if you're able to break down all the individual parts, you can be able to you can figure out like what that sentence means. So that's all I really have to say, you know, in regards to Esperanto. So hopefully by this point you can see that Esperanto is definitely a real language, and it has definitely you know come into its own. And you know there's a reason why Esperanto is one of the most popular, actually it is the most popular constructed language there is out there. You know, so that's all I have to say for today. So if you enjoyed this video, I definitely appreciate a like, and you can subscribe to this channel, and I'll be dropping like more videos like this, you know, in regards to Esperanto as well as language learning in general. So this is Jacob Laguerre. I'm signing off, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.